1. The pianist sat in the backstage silence with both hands resting on her knees. 2. She had played this piece hundreds of times and could perform it nearly in her sleep. 3. Yet now her fingers felt cold and a single question pressed against her concentration. 4. What was the very first note that her right hand needed to play? 5. The harder she searched for the note, the more the memory seemed to recede into fog. 6. Somewhere out beyond the curtain, an audience was settling into its seats. 7. She knew the music was inside her, but that knowledge was suddenly unavailable. 8. Her heart was drumming, and her breathing had become tight and shallow without permission. 9. She tried telling herself to calm down, but the command only seemed to increase the pressure. 10. This moment is not a failure of preparation, but a psychological event with its own rules. 11. Performance anxiety turns a well-rehearsed skill into something that feels fragile and foreign. 12. The first explanation people reach for is that nervousness simply blocks ability from coming out. 13. That simple answer works for a moment until you notice a sharper contradiction underneath it. 14. Why would a system built to help us survive make us forget exactly what matters most under a spotlight? 15. Psychologists call this experience performance anxiety, and it differs from ordinary stage fright. 16. Stage fright may arrive with jitters, but it can fade once the music begins to flow. 17. Performance anxiety, however, often intensifies right when precision and memory are most required. 18. It is not merely the fear of being judged or the fear of making a mistake before others. 19. At its core, performance anxiety involves the mind trying to control processes that usually run automatically. 20. Backstage, our pianist was not just nervous about the people waiting out in the dark. 21. She was internally monitoring every small sensation, as if her body had become a suspect. 22. The cost of this self-monitoring is that it steals the mental resources needed for fluent execution. 23. To understand why we need to follow what happens when a learned skill comes under conscious supervision. 24. Imagine learning to ride a bicycle and listing every muscle movement required to stay balanced. 25. Suddenly, the fluid action that had become second nature breaks apart into awkward pieces. 26. Performance anxiety does something similar to well-established patterns of musical performance or speech. 27. It shifts attention from the outside task to the inside mechanics and to the possibility of failure. 28. Researchers have examined this process in settings ranging from sports arenas to examination halls. 29. One recurring finding is that high pressure can consume the working memory essential for complex thinking. 30. Working memory is the mental workspace where you hold and manipulate information in the present moment. 31. When anxious thoughts fill that workspace, there is less room for the music or the equation. 32. This is why the pianist could not access the starting note, even though she had stored it perfectly. 33. The distraction theory of choking under pressure helps explain part of the difficulty. 34. Anxiety generates repetitive worries that compete directly with the task for attention and cognitive space. 35. But there is a second mechanism that is even more surprising, and it changes the whole picture. 36. Skilled actions like playing a familiar phrase are usually handled by efficient automatic processes. 37. Under pressure, many people try to consciously direct those processes as if rebuilding the skill piece by piece. 38. This shift from automatic control to explicit monitoring is called the self-focus or explicit monitoring theory. 39. When a golfer starts consciously thinking about the angle of her wrist, during a simple putt, her smooth stroke often disintegrates. 40. The brain is no longer trusting the practiced pattern, but instead micromanaging each component in sequence. 41. Experiments have tested this by asking half of a group of skilled athletes to focus on mechanics and the other half to focus on an external cue. 42. Those focusing on internal mechanics consistently showed slower and less accurate performance under pressure. 43. The pianist backstage was doing exactly this without knowing it when she hunted for the first note. 44. She was not letting her fingers remember their own path through the opening phrase. 45. Instead, she was trying to override the automatic system with a conscious searchlight that only made the darkness larger. 46. Performance anxiety therefore involves two thieves working together to undermine accomplishment. 47. Distraction steals mental bandwidth, while self-focus dismantles the smooth, automatic routines that had been reliably built. 48. But there is a twist that often goes unnoticed when people describe the experience of choking. 49. Many performers report that the fear begins months before the event and grows through a cycle of anticipation. 50. The mind rehearses the upcoming moment by imagining disaster, which inadvertently trains the body to associate the stage with threat. 51. The first time our pianist missed a note in a past recital, she encoded a sharp emotional memory of the mistake. 52. Her brain now treats a concert hall as a slightly dangerous environment that demands hypervigilance. 53. That hypervigilance feels like preparation, but it actually narrows attention and increases muscle tension. 54. Over time, the mere thought of performing can activate a threat response that is out of proportion to the actual risk. 55. This does not mean the danger is imaginary, but that the mind is responding to the emotional stakes of identity and belonging. 56. For many people, performance becomes a test not just of skill, but of their worth in the eyes of others. 57. When the self feels publicly on trial, the defensive reaction can short-circuit the very fluency that would showcase competence. 59. Someone raised in a highly competitive environment may carry internal expectations that raise the perceived pressure, even in a supportive room. 60. Performance anxiety therefore lives not only inside the individual, but in the meaning the situation has acquired through personal history and culture. 61. Our pianist is about to hear her name called from the stage manager, and she must make a choice inside the next 10 seconds. 62. The first instinct will be to double down on control by trying even harder to force the memory to appear. 63. Yet the evidence points in a direction that feels deeply uncomfortable because it asks her to do less rather than more. 64. Accepting the presence of anxiety instead of fighting to eliminate it opens a different pathway to performance. 65. Researchers working on attentional control theory have shown that the problem is not the anxious feeling itself, but how it redirects attention. 66. When a person stops treating anxiety as an emergency and relabels it as high arousal or readiness, the threat system can downregulate. 7. Saying to yourself, "I am excited rather than I am anxious," has been found to improve singing quality and public speaking delivery under pressure. 68. This reframing works because both anxiety and excitement share physiological features like a racing heart, but differ in cognitive interpretation. 69. The body is already preparing for effort, and the mind can interpret that activation as a helpful boost rather than as a sign of collapse. 70. Our pianist can choose to allow the jittery energy to stay in her body while gently guiding her attention to the first real cue of the music. 71. She might focus on the image of the conductor raising the baton or the sound of a breath she will take before the first phrase. 72. Shifting focus outward to a task-relevant target reduces the space available for internal monitoring and catastrophic rehearsal. 73. This is why many elite performers develop pre-performance routines that anchor attention on a simple external process rather than on internal tranquility. 74. A basketball player bounces the ball 3 times not for magic, but to return his awareness to a reliable automatic sequence. 75. A speaker might press her feet into the floor to feel grounded instead of scanning her own voice for tremor. 76. Here lies the central reversal that changes how the opening scene looks to us now. 77. Performance anxiety is not primarily a signal that skill has been lost, but a sign that the mind has shifted toward a goal it can never fully achieve. 78. That goal is complete certainty about an outcome before the performance has even begun. 79. The more the pianist tries to guarantee the perfect first note in advance, the more she disrupts the system that could deliver it in the moment. 80. The anxious brain confuses uncertainty with threat and seeks to eliminate ambiguity through mental rehearsal and control. 81. But music, like any live performance, only exists when someone risks stepping into the unknown with practiced trust. 82. The strongest insight walking out of 100 studies is that anxiety does its damage not through feeling nervous, but through the attempt to think your way out of feeling nervous. 83. The solution is not becoming fearless, but learning to redirect attention away from yourself and toward the task you prepared to do. 84. This reframes the pre-performance jitters as a companion that arrives because what you are about to do actually matters. 85. Now the pianist hears her name and the polite applause that follows through the heavy curtain. 86. She stands and walks toward the bright rectangle of the stage, not because the anxiety has vanished, but because she has stopped demanding its disappearance. 87. Her fingers are still cold, yet she is no longer interrogating them for reassurance about the future. 88. She gives her mind a simple job to do instead of a threat to manage. 89. The job is to notice the first key under her fingers and the specific weight of the piano action when she presses down. 90. The first note arrives not from a forced memory search, but from allowing the motor program to unfold as it was trained to do. 92. After the performance, she will still feel her heart pounding, and she will probably not play perfectly. 93. Yet the relationship between her mind and the skill has already shifted, because she has experienced a different way of being under pressure. 94. What this means for anyone facing a spotlight is that you can prepare for performance anxiety not by removing it, but by practicing focus under simulated stress. 95. Athletes train with crowd noise, and speakers rehearse with a small judgmental audience to build familiarity with an activated body. 96. A child learning an instrument can be taught that a fluttery stomach is part of caring deeply rather than evidence that something is broken inside them. 97. None of this guarantees flawless execution because uncertainty remains a permanent feature of live performance. 98. But understanding the psychology returns agency where the experience once felt like a hijacking. 99. The same pianist who could not recall that first note in the silent backstage now knows that the note was never missing. 100. It was only hidden behind the spotlight she had turned onto herself instead of onto the music.